Hi, everyone. This is Joey Lindstrom with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Thank you for joining us for this third Thursdays at 3 presentation. I've got 3:01. We're going to give people one more minute to log in, and then we will get started. Thank you for your patience. Hi, everyone. This is Joey Lindstrom. Thank you for joining us today for what is, if I'm counting correctly, our fifth installment of the third Thursdays at 3 webinar and podcast series. As you'll see on this screen, the title for today's webinar is Voter Registration Part 2. That's right. If you missed part 1, you can go back and look at the recording on ourhomes-ourvotes.org. You can see that recording as well as previous recordings we've done on legal considerations for nonprofits, planning an effective voter engagement campaign, and tips and important tips, tools, and partners for voter registration. So all of those recordings are available online. As we get started today, we will go over just a couple quick general logistics. I want you all to know that there will absolutely be time for Q&A at the end of our presentation. So if you'd like to, please enter questions as they occur to you into the control panel of your webinar screen. You'll find that control panel on the right-hand side, and then the questions box should be at the bottom. We will also provide access to both a video recording and a copy of the slides that we're using today to all participants following the webinar, hopefully tomorrow, but within the next couple of days, certainly. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, having any issues with the audio, or if your slides aren't advancing with our presentation, please do shoot a quick email to Brooke Shipwright at the email address there on your screen, and she can help resolve any issues you might be having. Or if it's a technology problem on our end, we might do a brief pause and then fix it and resume. Okay, so our agenda for today, I'll do the brief overview of Our Homes, Our Votes that I've done at the beginning of each of these webinars. We'll talk about voter registration and low-income residents, specifically residents of subsidized housing. We'll talk about finding and targeting subsidized renters with your voter engagement campaigns. We'll go over some best practices, and then we'll have some question and answer. So your presenters today are from NLIHC, myself, I'm the fellow on the right, and then Dan Emanuel will be joining us from NLIHC's research team to show us some really helpful tools about identifying residents of subsidized housing. And Dan is the gentleman there on the left. So just a quick introduction to what Our Homes, Our Votes 2020 is. There are essentially 3 parts of it. And as you can see on this graphic, we really approach it as registration, education, and mobilization. Ultimately, we need to register voters in order for them to have a meaningful voice, but we want them to be informed voters when they get to the polls. And of course, mobilization is about making sure they are at the polls. And why do we do this? Why do we focus so much of our work on elections? Well, the fact of the matter is, one of the reasons low-income housing and rental housing are not prioritized in public policy, and specifically federal policy made in Washington, D.C., is the voting disparity that you see on this chart before you. In the blue, you'll see voter participation for renters, and in the black, you see voter participation for homeowners. And when you see this, it shouldn't necessarily be surprising that policymakers focus more heavily on solutions for homeowners than they do so for renters. This disparity is even more stark when we look at it not by renter versus homeowner, but by high income versus low income. Low income people, when they turn out as a significant voting bloc, we'll find that elected officials will be very responsive to their needs, but as they are the lower voting block when compared to people who are higher income, they are too often left out and forgotten in conversations about community solutions. This is a shame because we know from polling that 83% of the public agrees that elected officials are not paying enough attention to the high cost of housing and the need for more affordable housing. In fact, 76% say that they are more likely to vote for a candidate who has a detailed plan for making housing more affordable. And for those of you who are doing the math there, you'll see that there are 7% of people who think elected officials aren't paying enough attention, but aren't interested in voting for a candidate who will do so. Let's move on to voter registration and our topic for today. This is one of our first narrower audiences for a webinar in Our Homes, Our Votes. We did in our previous webinar a lot of considerations for voter registration, but many people in our field and in our network of contacts work with different audiences. Some organizations work with the low-income community broadly. Some organizations work specifically with people who are experiencing homelessness and don't have an address. This webinar is really for organizations who are interested in conducting voter registration work with communities who are in fact living in public housing, right? And so let's talk about, excuse me, I said public housing, I meant subsidized housing. And I should actually define that term as we get started here. I'm going to say subsidized housing many times throughout this presentation. And when I do that, I'm sort of referring to all federal subsidized housing. So we're referring to not just public housing, but also project-based rental assistance, low-income housing tax credit housing, National Housing Trust Fund funded housing, anything with the home program, CDBG, and so on and so forth. So who lives in subsidized housing? Many of you know this, but it is predominantly families with children, seniors, people with disabilities, low-wage workers, and caretakers of relatives or loved ones who have a significant disability. On the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see a breakdown that we do for extremely low-income people, not all of whom live in subsidized housing. And of course, subsidized housing includes income groups beyond just extremely low-income households. But this gives you a glimpse into what the types of households are who live in subsidized housing. And so you will be, in many cases, delighted to see that the people who live in subsidized housing don't live up to oftentimes the stigmas or stereotypes applied to them, and are generally just the people who you know in your community who live with lower incomes, often fixed incomes, or often low incomes that are set by low wage jobs, minimum wage jobs, or jobs that don't provide enough work hours in a given work week. So what are the concerns of subsidized renters? I want to start by pointing out the first issue you see on this list is not the supply of affordable homes, right? Because subsidized renters usually are already in an affordable home. And because of this, their interests are a little bit different than the broader low-income community, who very often are living on waiting lists and hoping an affordable home will become available to them. Sometimes, and very often, the top concern for people who are living in subsidized housing is housing quality and the maintenance of the housing, the repairs, and making sure that everything works. And then secondarily, the safety of the housing, being sure that they can feel safe in their homes and in shared spaces of buildings and in shared courtyards or parks and so forth, and feeling safe without necessarily having an oppressive security presence in their communities. Obviously, housing quality and housing safety are things that are better brought to subsidized housing when housing providers and public housing agencies have enough funding to be able to keep up with their maintenance concerns and to be able to provide for fences and locks and staff that can create a safe environment for all residents. Very often, residents of subsidized housing will be interested in the community development in the neighborhood around their home, parks, schools, libraries, and the things that construct a vibrant community that will be welcoming for them, their guests, their families, and their neighbors. Increasingly, stability is becoming a very important concern for subsidized renters. For people who live in public housing, sometimes this is not as huge of a concern because it is permanently affordable. But for residents of low-income housing tax credit housing or project-based rental assistance, these programs come with covenants of time-limited affordability, sometimes 15 years in the case of the tax credit, but usually around 30 years or 50 years depending on the program. If we do not, as voters and as advocates, secure more funding for preserving the affordability of affordable homes, many of them will convert to market rate prices, and the low-income residents who live there will have to, in many cases, be pushed out of their neighborhoods. This is why preservation is so important, and it's something that residents of subsidized housing will have on their mind. Very often they are aware of their neighbors or friends who have been pushed out of their housing because the subsidy was not continued and the preservation was not secured. So housing stability is a top issue for people to keep in mind as they are structuring their messaging on how to approach residents of subsidized housing for voter registration. But of course, low-income renters in subsidized housing aren't only concerned with their own needs. They exist in a community of friends, relatives, loved ones, and neighbors who don't have housing that is affordable to them. And they are very aware of who is languishing on the waiting list and who would be thrilled if an apartment became available to them. And while people in subsidized housing usually have, through the subsidy, an apartment or a home that is reasonably affordable to them, that doesn't mean they aren't also interested in expanding the supply of affordable homes, which many of you on the call today and all of us here at NOIHC are always focused on. It might not be their top issue, but it's something that they care about deeply and should be incorporated into your messaging. So, who should approach subsidized renters? This is a really important consideration as we start to think about increasing registration rates for people who live in buildings or properties that have a subsidy attached to them. By far, the best person to do the approach for voter registration, especially when we're talking about people who live in low-income housing, will be their neighbors. People who they know, people who they trust, people who they rely on. When those people can bring a message about voter registration and the importance of participating in an election, that's when the message is most easily received. The best campaigns for doing registration among residents of subsidized housing are those that identify captains or leaders for particular buildings, or in larger buildings for particular building floors. And the captains or leaders of the voter registration effort take on a certain accountability for ensuring that all of their neighbors get registered. These have the best impact because it's neighbors talking to neighbors about being registered and getting to the polls. Outside of neighbors, the next best organization to rely on are resident associations or tenant unions. I feel many of you on today's webinar are from resident associations or tenant unions. These are organizations that have legitimacy and credibility to low-income residents of subsidized housing and are often very effective messengers when doing door-to-door registration or doing registration events in meeting rooms or public spaces. Community organizations such as the local League of Women Voters or other organizations that might be focused on registering low-income people are the next best messengers to take the clipboard and do some door-to-door work. These organizations very often have the interests of the renters most dear to their heart and carry the message most effectively, right? The next two categories both come from the perspective of the owner and the operator of the property. Many property owners who provide subsidized housing are very interested in seeing more elected officials who care about affordable rental housing as a top priority. Indeed, whether you're a public housing agency or a low-income housing tax credit provider or a community developer using home or National Housing Trust Fund money, you know that you can do a better job of meeting your mission and providing housing that meets the standards of your residents if there is significant funding for those federal programs. Achieving that requires more voter registration among your residents. Resident services staff for the properties that have those staff often have developed a good rapport, a good relationship with many of the renters, and can be very effective at increasing registration. When resident services staff aren't available at a given property or don't have the capacity to participate in voter registration, property management staff can be helpful as well, though this is not the preferred route. There is a certain conflict, of course, when the person who asks you to pay your rent is also the person asking you to register to vote. Resident services staff usually provide the best separation between those two spaces, and that should really be emphasized. For locked apartment buildings that are subsidized, it's really hard for actual campaigns for candidates to get inside and do voter registration, though sometimes that happens. And not locked apartment buildings campaigns go to all the time. Campaigns are effective at registering voters in communities. They're a little bit less effective than the other groups I've listed here because, as you might expect, the campaigns have something to gain from registering low-income voters. And because they have something to gain from it, they're not as credible and they're not as immediately trusted. Indeed, very often, one of the reasons we have such low turnout rates among low-income renters can be that low-income renters for decades and decades have been voting and they've been watching candidates promise a better future, and that better future doesn't really turn out to apply to them as things unfold. This is a voter apathy that we talk about in the webinar that we did last month, and I encourage you to watch the recording. But it's a voter apathy that is really applied to campaigns, and very often low-income renters will be a little bit more suspect of people who are doing voter registration through that lens. The Our Homes, Our Votes 2020 project is, of course, nonpartisan, and we expect that most people who are participating in these webinars are doing nonpartisan voter engagement as well. And for specifically increasing registration rates of subsidized renters, doing it in a nonpartisan manner will always be most effective. So the next slide I'd like to show you is just a little bit about the impact of effectively registering and mobilizing residents of subsidized housing. This is a slide, this is a chart that I use very often. It is provided by our partners at the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California. And in Northern California, they've had several ballot initiatives over the past several elections in which voters were going to the polls and deciding on whether or not to tax themselves to pay for more housing. For the most part, NPH and its partners have been successful in passing these ballot initiatives. But when you look at the counties listed here, the numbers that are being shown are the number of registered voters at properties whose owners are members of the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California. And that's all interesting. You know, in these counties, we have, this many people in subsidized housing. But the three circled numbers on the far right are the important ones, because these are the counties where the overall margin of victory at the polls was a smaller number than the number of registered voters in subsidized housing, right? And what we see is a deliberate and effective method to register residents of subsidized housing can be the difference maker in several important elections. California is one snapshot where we have good data, but we know that this makes a difference in elections all throughout the country. So how do we connect with subsidized renters? You've heard me mention already the effectiveness of a good door-to-door campaign, especially when it's led by neighbors, residents associations, or tenant councils. Meetings where we can find subsidized renters, such as tenant council meetings or neighborhood gatherings, where we know a lot of subsidized renters attend. Oftentimes, depending on the neighborhood, you might find high concentrations of subsidized renters at community centers, churches, or service centers. Housing providers, the actual landlord, the actual owner of the building, very often will use newsletters or mailings, or they might put up posters and bulletins in common spaces. These are great spaces to encourage people or to remind people to register to vote. It's particularly important for public housing agencies who operate voucher programs. The difficulty with organizing voucher households, of course, is that they're spread out throughout a community. And so it's difficult to sort of find where they are and just do the door-to-door. For this reason, the mailings of public housing agencies and the agencies that administer vouchers, if not PHAs, are extremely important. The final note I'll make is people aren't opening their mail anymore. It's hard to find people when they're home, but social media is a very common and usable tool, and it's very commonly used among low-income renters. I encourage you specifically to use Facebook and specifically to use Twitter to reach out and make sure that people in your network are aware of how they can register to vote, especially if they live in one of the 38 states that allows online voter registration. Where do subsidized renters live? Surprise, it's everywhere, right? I think very often we can get caught up in thinking that subsidized renters only live in tall, high-rise buildings in the center of a given city, when in fact, high-rise buildings are a small percentage of the overall subsidized housing stock in our country. Subsidized housing is not just in major cities. You'll find it in rural communities. You'll find it in small towns. You'll find it in suburbs. And very often, it's not even locked apartment buildings. For example, with public housing, the most common public housing is a courtyard setting with each apartment having its own outward-facing door. Mixed income housing developments and mixed income neighborhoods have a lot of subsidized housing in them. Sometimes you'll find a building that has 100 apartments in it and 10 of them might be subsidized. Or sometimes the building is only 4 units or 4 homes or a row of 5 townhomes. And I kind of stress the geographic diversity of where subsidized housing is, because sometimes in our efforts to register low-income renters, we only go to the largest and most recognizable subsidized housing in our community, and that probably represents only a fraction of the households who we should be focusing on and targeting with our efforts. Indeed, there are a lot of scattered sites for subsidized housing, and especially for people with vouchers. So the question becomes, how do we find the people who we know are benefiting from these essential housing subsidy programs, and how do we get them to register to vote and participate more deliberately in our election? Well, good news. We have a tool that can be very helpful for identifying where in your community housing subsidies exist, as you consider which neighborhoods, buildings, and addresses you need to approach about voter registration. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dan Emanuel, to walk you through using the National Housing Preservation Database for voter engagement efforts.
Hey, everybody. So just to give you some background, the National Housing Preservation Database is a research tool that was created by NLHC and PARC for identifying federally subsidized housing. And it's most commonly used for research and guiding preservation efforts for housing that's at risk of being lost from the affordable housing stock. But today, I'm going to talk about how you can use it as a starting point to guide voter engagement efforts and begin building a voter list for residents of assisted housing. And I'll walk through how you can identify assisted properties using the database, and then how you can share that data through a very basic map. And you can do all of this with tools that are completely free and accessible to people of virtually any skill level. So in order to figure out where your tenants are, you're going to have to go to the preservation database, right? So you can go there by navigating to preservationdatabase.org. And then if you haven't used the preservation database before, you're going to have to register. Basically, unless you work for a for-profit company and you're using it for some sort of for-profit purpose, registration is totally free. So once you've done that, you can go ahead and log in. You just click on that login tab you see on that page there. And then you'll sign in, which is really simple, all pretty straightforward. And then once you signed in, you're going to get to a screen where you see a blue button that just says Data Access. And you'll click on that. And what that's going to do is that's going to take you to the main page for the database, what we typically refer to as the filter grid. So the way you're going to want to start on the filter grid is essentially you're going to want to go to that drop-down menu you see in that red box where it says Subsidy Status, and you just click Active. And what that's going to do is that eventually all your properties that you'll find are only going to be the active ones, right? Places that are still receiving some sort of subsidy. And then right below that, there's an other drop-down menu that says Program, and what that lets you do is essentially you can pick what type of properties you want to see in your eventual search results, right? Based on subsidy type. So here in the example here, I've selected Section 8, LIHTC, and public housing, right? And you'll just hit Apply Filters, right? And what will happen then is all the other subsidies will be excluded from the filter grid that's below there. And once you've done that, you'll see there's kind of a header row there with a bunch of text boxes in that. And you can directly type in there to further filter your grid, right? So you could, for example, if you want to do voter turnout in Mobile, Alabama, you could just type in Mobile and Alabama and city and state, and that will filter the entire grid and it'll show you all the assisted properties of the subsidy type you're interested in for Mobile, Alabama. And you can also actually type in the congressional district that you're interested in looking at, and a whole other number of variables, right? And then, so once you've narrowed everything down, the properties you want and the geography you want, right, you're just going to hit Export Filter Grid, and that red box that I just showed you there, and then you're going to click the option Export Properties. And then alternatively, if you're like me and you prefer working in Excel, you can also just, if you see to the left of that red box there, it says Download Complete Database. You can click on the drop-down menu next to that, and you can basically select from a file for each state in the U.S. for active subsidies in that state. You select that, and you hit Download Complete Database, and you will get a complete property-level database for every property in your state, right? And then you can do all your filtering and everything on your own in Excel, which I personally find easier, but some people, like the filter grid instead. So once you've done that, you're gonna, again, you're gonna end up with your Excel data that you export, right? And every row in that Excel sheet, it's gonna be a property. It represents one property, and there are a ton of variables, and it's probably all very confusing if you've never used the database before. But basically, all you're really going to need out of there are a couple of variables, right? You're going to need a property name, property address, city, state, zip. Having total units is really useful because it helps you know like how much like voter registration forms or literature you need to print out and bring with you to a certain place. It also helps you figure out where more people are, right? Another really important thing to make sure you include in your final Excel file are the latitude and longitude, and I'll explain why in a second. And then it's also helpful to have the county and then, of course, the congressional district if that's applicable in your case, right? And then you're just going to save your Excel file like you would normally onto your computer. So the next step here is the easy part, really, and that's creating the map. So once you've saved all of your Excel data, you have all your properties out of the database, you can just go to Google Maps, right? And then, as you can see here, once you've navigated there, you can click on where that red box is, where it says Menu, and you pull up that drop-down menu, and then you're going to click on the where it says Your Places, and you click on Your Places, and then you're going to navigate to the Maps tab, and then from the Maps tab, at the very bottom of that tab, you're just going to click Create Map. And what's going to happen is basically Google will walk you through the entire process of uploading your Excel file. And then it will, what we call geocode, it'll use either the addresses or the latitudes and the longitudes, and it'll show you the exact location in one map of all the properties that were in your Excel file. Right? It's super easy. You don't need any kind of like background in GIS or anything to do that, right? And then within a wizard function where it walks you through everything, you're able to kind of like pick what kind of icons you want to do, what kind of variables you want to show in your final map. And eventually, after you walk through all the steps that Google gives you, right, what you're going to end up with is a map of all the properties that you can actually send a link to. So for example, if you've got like a whole team of people doing, voter registration or get out the vote on a particular weekend, you're working on subsidized, turning out subsidized tenants, you can literally just email or text that link to all of the people you're working with, and they can literally open it up on the phone that's in their pocket and just take it straight out with the material. So it's It's very quick and dirty, but I think an effective way to do a very simple or guide a very simple, voter engagement effort. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Joe.
All right, thanks, Dan. And I hope everybody really understands the purpose of putting together a good map and identifying where the subsidized renters are, because a lot of the assumptions that we apply to where low-income renters live in our community very often just aren't correct. And so we hope you'll use this tool to better target your efforts. We'd like to talk a little bit more about some other best practices to keep in mind as you go about registering renters of subsidized housing. And the first one I'd like to talk about is voter lists. Voter lists are by far the most effective voter engagement tool for ongoing interaction, right? A voter list tells you for a given address who the voter is who lives there, whether they turned out in the previous elections, or whether their voter registration is active. This can be very important if you organize in a building or a set of buildings and you want to compare if everyone who's registered to vote is up to date in the voter database. You can buy a voter list from any number of vendors, or you can usually get one for free or close to free by contacting your local county clerk or Board of Elections office, and then use whatever tools you have available to compare the property addresses to whether or not voters are registered behind all of those doors. In many cases, a voter list is really important for updating registrations and identifying where people have moved, and identifying which individuals need to provide new registrations because in some cases they might have been scrubbed off of voter rolls in a voter suppression effort. Remember, of course, that registering voters only makes a difference if they actually make it to the polling location and cast a ballot. And for this reason, it's important for your campaign, your effort, to be able to keep track of who you've registered, who you know is registered, and who you can turn out on election day. There are, of course, several different levels of voter lists, and using the most simple ones can still have a really big impact. This next slide I'm going to show you actually was included in voter registration part 1, but so applicable to subsidized housing, I wanted to include it here again. And that's overcoming the common obstacle of accessing locked apartment buildings. For those of you who are going to be visiting subsidized renters in a door-to-door manner and urging them to register to vote, please remember, voter registration is not soliciting. And simple indications of no soliciting do not apply to civic engagement. Now that said, if getting to a particular door involves entering privately owned space, you very often do need permission to do so. But rest assured, it's not any kind of criminal action or anything like that. Now, most owners and operators of locked apartment buildings, especially subsidized properties, will allow you to go in and knock on doors and register voters or set up a table in their community meeting. You just have to reach out and make the request well beforehand so that they know that you'll be there and that they can make sure that they can make the residents aware of your presence and so forth, right? So asking for permission very often is an effective way to do this, and you'll find that many property owners are a very eager and interested partner in being a part of what you're doing. This is especially true if your voter registration effort is nonpartisan. And remember, neighbors can always engage neighbors. If your campaign as an organization can't get into a locked apartment building, any particular resident might be able to invite you in and then walk with you as you go door to door or as you talk to people as they enter or leave the building. When you're with a resident or a neighbor, that will always make your engagement above board. And another thing that I'd like to bring up just really quickly, because it comes up very often when we're registering low-income renters in subsidized properties. Unfortunately, low-income people, as you all know, disproportionately feel the impact of over-incarceration and criminal involvement. And so many formerly incarcerated individuals will be part of your efforts if you're targeting low-income renters. It's important to remember that in most places, a person with a conviction who has completed all of their parole and probation is eligible to vote. The only states where all felony convictions are permanently banned from voting are Virginia, Kentucky, and Iowa. On the other end of the spectrum, there are 2 states where everybody is allowed to vote, even if they're currently in prison. and those are Vermont and Maine. But to get a sense of what the rules are in your state, I've included on this slide a link to a great map resource that is maintained by the American Civil Liberties Union. So that's our presentation for today. It looks like we wrapped a little bit earlier than some of our other webinars, and that's not a bad thing. But it gives us a good chunk of time for questions, if we have any. May from our communications team is here with us and monitoring the questions box. May, do we have any questions coming in at this point?
Yeah, we have a few. The first one was, how can we be sure our efforts aren't redundant with other groups in our communities?
Oh, that's a really good question, and it probably comes up when you look at, Dan walking people through the map, and you see that other people might be doing voter registration in the same buildings that you're doing voter registration in. The truth is, you can't be sure that your efforts aren't redundant. But I'll say two things beyond that. One is, it's not necessarily a problem if people have their door knocked too many times by someone who's trying to get them involved in the election. Because ultimately, every time you go door to door, there are going to be some people who aren't home, other people who don't have time to talk to you that day. And if another group comes through, 1 week later, maybe that makes a difference. The second thing I'll say is, when we did our webinar on planning an effective voter engagement campaign, one of the things we emphasized is building a coalition of other groups that are similarly aligned with your mission. And having that coalition might help you say, all right, well, we're going to take these 3 neighborhoods and knock on every door. Why don't you take those 3 neighborhoods and go to all the subsidized properties over there? Taking the time to build that coalition and find out who in your community is doing this work and is active in this work can help you better target your efforts and not sort of do the work that's already been done and so forth.
Okay, the next question is, do you have specific tools for public housing agencies that help make the case for public housing funds to be used for voter engagement efforts?
That's an excellent question, and the answer is not quite yet. This is something I've been working on with some other housing providers in terms of putting together some messaging tips and some fact sheets that can be put up in elevators and common spaces or included in newsletters and so forth. So that information is forthcoming, I would say, within the next month or so, because our next webinar conversation will be about the role of housing providers in voter engagement. And between now and then, we are planning to unveil a lot of new tools that are specific to housing providers. And I should say, since the question is about public housing specifically, just a quick reminder that public housing agencies can participate in voter engagement work, as long as it's, of course, nonpartisan participation, right? HUD in the 90s put out a specific, very explicit letter saying that voter registration is an okay use of PHA time and organizational capacity.
Okay, the next question is, are there any housing programs that are not included in the preservation database?
Yes. There are a couple. I should have mentioned this earlier. The two that come, so overall, just to remind you that the database is primarily focused on federal housing subsidies, so it typically doesn't have state subsidies in there, with a couple of exceptions. So I know, just off the top of my head, Connecticut and I believe Florida have state subsidies are included for both of those states, and we're working on expanding that. But at the federal level, we don't yet have housing trust fund properties in the database. And obviously, and we're not ever going to probably have housing choice vouchers in there because they're not project-based subsidy. And we don't currently have project-based vouchers, but we've actually been working with HUD on updating that. So in the next year or so, we are going to be adding project-based vouchers to the database. So yeah, it's largely just housing trust fund units and project-based vouchers that come to mind in terms of what we're missing.
Great. So another question we have says, getting people registered is only part of the effort. We also need to focus on transportation. Do you have any strategies that can assist in PHAs and other nonprofits to get voters to the polls?
That's a great question, and it's something we're going to cover in, I believe, August or September when we start our voter mobilization webinars. But you're absolutely right. Registration is just one piece of a full, comprehensive voter engagement puzzle, and there are various barriers to getting people to the polls, and transportation is definitely one of them. The good news on this is getting people to the polls, providing people with a ride to the polls, is one of the easiest things, in my experience, to recruit volunteers and community sort of donations for. You will very often find volunteers who are happy to drive people to the polls, or you might find transportation companies or organizations or churches who have buses or vans who will make their buses or vans available on those days. That's a very common thing. That is available, and especially important in so many subsidized properties where people might have limited mobility. One thing I will encourage you to think about as you're confronting the transportation barrier is to make all of the voters in your campaign and in your area aware of any potential early voting opportunities, so that they know they have a couple of weeks in which they can cast their vote, and it doesn't all have to happen on one day. So if there's a particular day when they have access to transportation, they can do so. And then also make voters aware of their opportunities for no excuse absentee balloting, if that exists in your state, so that they can vote and cast their ballot by mail rather than having to show up on election day. For your campaign, this can be particularly effective because then getting out the vote doesn't have to happen on one day, but happens over a period of several days, because you're getting out the vote by making sure people get in the ballots that they've received in the mail. So we're going to consider this in a much more expanded fashion when we get into voter mobilization in a few months, but definitely feel free to follow up for more details on transportation issues.
Great. So the next question is, lots of subsidized residents in our community feel overwhelmed by the many different offices they have to vote for. How do we help them feel empowered?
Oh, that's a great question, and that's definitely something that I've heard a lot when doing voter registration work. It comes up a lot with low-income voters. I guess I would say it comes up a lot with new voters, people who haven't voted a lot. It comes up with young voters very often. People feel like they have to be an expert to go cast a vote, right? When the fact of the matter is, people who are homeowners or high income, they're not more informed on the candidates for municipal judge or, county treasurer necessarily. And in most elections, those lower offices get fewer votes in the end anyway. There's a whole lot of work we do, and that your campaigns should do to inform voters about what they'll be voting on, but just being registered is never any kind of threat to a potential voter. It just gives them the option. And sometimes that's the best way to get the registration to happen, is to make it sort of a bite-sized piece of an overall process. They don't have to be an expert on all the candidates and what all the candidates have said. There's time for that. They don't even have to turn out to vote. They have the option to vote or not. But for right now, getting registered gives them the option to vote. And one of the things I remind specifically low-income renters of is, the people who you think have a very different perspective of our community's future, the people who are very hostile to low-income housing and low-income communities, they're going out and voting whether they have enough information or not, right? And in fact, we know that very often they don't have enough information. And so their voice counts. Shouldn't we make sure your voice counts too? Can sometimes be effective messaging when talking to new voters or voters who are feeling overwhelmed by the many different offices and many different choices they have to make. May, do we have any other questions?
Yes, we still have a couple
Great.
more. So the next question is, you said that people who are low income do not vote, and therefore Congress does not pay attention to renters. However, do you think that there are congressional members who do not care about renters while sliding with the rich even when they're voting at a higher rate?
I would bet that there are members of Congress who, despite the number of votes that are available in rental communities, just ideologically believe more in the needs of homeowners and high-income people. That certainly wouldn't surprise me. The truth is, we don't have precise enough data to be able to break it down district by district, where are the renters turning out and where are they not turning out. That's data that we would love to have, and we're sort of exploring ways to calculate that, because I would love to be able to look at, these are the congressional districts with the highest percentages of renters in them, and these are the comparative vote totals of renters versus homeowners, and then sort of see if we can see the connection between the behavior then of their elected officials. What we have instead is, frankly, the voting records of the elected officials and the way we recognize the demographics of their communities and sort of how they behave. We also have their public statements. You'll be very surprised that some elected officials will go out and very outward and very specifically state that, homeowners vote, and that's why we care about protecting home ownership, right? It's not something that they hide. It's not something that they're ashamed of. Some of them are very, very clear about it. So it is true that the connection that we're making between policy behavior of elected officials and voter turnout of low-income renters is an inference, but it's an inference that is pretty clearly expressed in the last multiple decades of policymaking, I think.
And then the next question is, how do you reply to a resident who is unsure whether they will be in the same address between now and Election Day?
Oh, that's a great question. So residents who are considering moving or who think they might move can absolutely, in any given moment, register where they are and then re-register after they've moved. This is something that varies state by state and sometimes even county by county. So I would recommend you check in with your local county clerk on how to do this, because there are some situations where if I register to vote 10 days before the election and then 3 days before the election I move, even though I've moved, because my voter registration was so recent, they will still allow me to vote at the polling location I had at my previous address, right? But that's something that is different, as I said, kind of state by state, county by county. They will treat that situation a little bit differently.
That was all our questions.
Those are some great questions. Thank you, everyone. So I want to close just by reminding everyone that this is not our final webinar. We've got a whole bunch of them coming up, 10 more, in fact. The next one will be in February, where we're going to talk about the role of housing providers in voter engagement. And so this will be the people who work for the public housing agencies and work for the community development corporations and the housing providers out there. And then our next webinar after that will be about how do we engage candidates and get them to talk about housing issues. Then we'll talk about educating voters, work through some common challenges of voting. And then in August and September, really get into voter mobilization, as I was mentioning, before having an Election Day webinar in October. So we hope you'll continue to stay involved in the series and that you'll continue to stay in touch. I do want to pitch that please, if you can, consider becoming a member of NLIHC. We are able to do this work and provide additional resources because we have the support of our members, and we appreciate you joining at whatever member contribution rate you can. And then finally, stay in touch. That's me again and my contact information, but you should know that I do this work with a wonderful team of other organizers, and you can find the organizer for your state by visiting that URL on the screen right there. So with that, May, I'll just ask if any other questions have popped up. It looks like there have been no more questions. I really want to thank you all for joining our webinar today and for being so involved, and I hope we'll stay in touch as things move forward. Have a great day. Bye.